I'm Josh Larky, and this is the Dominator, the Week 12 Fantasy Football Start Sit Show. Welcome in, everybody. Welcome in. It's Thursday morning. Let's get right down to it. At quarterback, start Justin Herbert. Fantasy Pros consensus quarterback 4 on the week for good reason versus the Ravens. So when I do my advanced matchups, which I will release on Twitter later today at JLarkyTweets Thursday, when I release all my matchups charts, you will see that quarterbacks against the Ravens do very well. On average, they score 3 fantasy points above their season average. So if a quarterback's been averaging 17 fantasy points per game, we should expect him 17 plus 3, 20 to score about 20 fantasy points against the Ravens. That's 4th best. Herbert himself has at least 19 fantasy points in 4 straight weeks. I think he's going to make it 5 straight this week. It's the highest game total of week 12. This Chargers-Ravens game, it's over 50 points. A lot of action should be happening. And when you look at the spread, the Chargers are 3-point underdogs. It should be a good game. There should be a lot of passing. Stream. Anthony Richardson, Fantasy Pros consensus, quarterback 15 versus the Lions. That's disrespectful. Now, Detroit's a tough matchup, but so were the Jets last week. Richardson had 28 fantasy points last week. He had over 270 passing yards. He completed 20 of 30. That's a 67% completion rate. That's really good. He carried the ball 10 times. He had 1 passing touchdown. He had 2 rushing touchdowns. If you're looking for some upside this week, Richardson once again played like the top 5 fantasy quarterback he was expected to be before this season began. Now, before we hit running backs, just a quick note. I think everyone out there that's listening to this podcast is aware of Fast Draft. Full transparency, I am an investor in Fast Draft. I trust Matt Kelly. I trust Billy Muzio. But let me just say this. Just because I'm an investor doesn't mean that I can't also enjoy the product. I enjoy the product. They just dropped $5 DFS drafts. For anyone out there that's done Underdog Fantasy, a sponsor of this show, you might have done the Battle Royales. It's basically like these 5-minute drafts each week where you basically just draft rather than using salary constraints for DFS. You essentially just have a quick 30-second timer and you pick players in a snake draft format. Well, Fast Draft has that too. They're just $5 and I'm having a ton of fun. And I think these drafts, no offense to the user base, they're a little soft. And I think it's because a lot of these users are still new to this type of DFS style. So I'm in there. I'm ripping drafts. My handle is Josh Larky. You might even see me in there. They take 5 minutes. They're $5 right now. You just get out on the action. It says $5. Just try it out. If you don't like it, you can be angry in the comments. I will field those questions. I will handle them like a man. And I'm also like a man. I will start at running back, Aaron Jones. Fantasy Pros consensus running back 15 at the Bears. Now, the Bears are quietly a top 8 matchup for opposing running backs. The Bears clamp down against the pass, but they're soft against the run. Aaron Jones has at least 16 touches in 5 straight games. He's just been a little quiet recently with the fantasy points, but he has 12 red zone carries over the past 4 weeks. He just hasn't happened to score in that time frame. Touchdown regressions incoming soon. It's a great matchup. And I was surprised with Bye-Mageddon with 6 teams on bye. 6 teams on bye, Aaron Jones running back 15. Offensive. I'm offended. I'm starting him. I'm also starting. We're going to monitor the situation just to make sure we don't hear beat reporters go, Isaiah Pacheco is the lead back getting every touch. I don't think that's going to happen. I'm starting Kareem Hunt. Fantasy Pros consensus running back 21 on the week at the Panthers. So there's worries Isaiah Pacheco might be back. But it's a game versus Carolina. The Chiefs are going to be favored by double-digit points. Carolina is the best matchup for fantasy running backs. Running backs score 8 fantasy points above expectation against the Panthers. So you look at whatever a running back room's fantasy points are, add 8. And that's what we should expect for their points per game when they face the Panthers. Running backs are averaging over 130 rushing yards per game against them. There's no need to rush Isaiah Pacheco back or force heavy snaps for him. I know he's been limited in practice, but even if he returns, it's Carolina. You really think they're going to force feed Isaiah Pacheco this week? I certainly don't. I think they lean conservative here. I think you're going to get close to 20 carries from Kareem Hunt in the perfect matchup for a running back. Just start him. Wide receiver, start Lad McConkey. Consensus wide receiver 17 versus the Ravens. I like Herbert. I like McConkey. So the Ravens are allowing the most fantasy points to wide receivers. McConkey's averaging 88 yards per game over the past month. It's the highest game total of week 12. We'll talk about McConkey more later. It's a little trick, little tip, little hint at what an underdog fantasy pick might be later in the show. Stay tuned. We like Lad McConkey this week. If you need some upside, you can start Jamieson Williams. Consensus wide receiver 23 at the Colts. Now, when you look at outside receivers, this is the 7th best matchup possible is the Colts. Outside receivers average over 2 fantasy points per game above expected against them, 7th best. Lions have the highest implied team total. Vegas betting markets expect 29 offensive points, 29. Basically 30 points coming in from the Lions. That's 4 touchdowns for week 12. There's high touchdown upside. He's coming off a game with over 100 yards and a touchdown. We might be able to make it another game with over 100 yards and a touchdown. Calvin Ridley, start him. Consensus wide receiver 24 at the Texans. Texans are a top 12 matchup for outside receivers like Ridley. Now I know I told you to start Ridley last week. He only caught 4 of 6 targets for 58 yards. He had averaged 21 fantasy points per game in his 3 games without DeAndre Hopkins before that. So DeAndre Hopkins gets traded to the Chiefs. 3 straight games of 21 fantasy points on average. We're like, oh yeah. We like Ridley. And then 10 fantasy points, catches 4 for 58. What happened? Well, I mean, it's variance. It's the receiver position. He also had a 51-yard touchdown called back. Illegal formation penalty. If that happens, he has another 20 fantasy point week. Give me some slack, folks. I deserve it. The Titans are more than touchdown underdogs against the Texans. They're going to need to chuck the ball once again. I am into it. Josh Downs, start him. Wide receiver 25 versus the Lions. Now, the Lions are the number 1 slot matchup in all of fantasy football. The Lions, number 1. Slot receivers average 4.5 more fantasy points than expected. Josh Downs just went 5 catches, 84 yards, and a touchdown versus the Jets. That is 19.5 PPR fantasy points last week versus the Jets with Anthony Richardson at quarterback. This is a better matchup versus the Lions. It is the best matchup. It's a game where the Colts most likely trail for the majority of this game. And then Richardson, to his credit, like I mentioned before, completed 20 of 30 passes for over 270 yards versus the Jets in his first start since the benching. I have faith. And if you're desperate, start Michael Pittman, consensus wide receiver 42 versus the Lions as well. If you're desperate, wide receiver 42, 6 teams on bye, disrespectful. Michael Pittman just led this team with 8 targets last week. I think he's a low-end fantasy wide receiver 3 type for this week rather than a mid-range wide receiver 4. Detroit's a tough matchup for outside receivers this year. But folks, I want you, if you're listening at 1.5 speed, turn it down to 1 speed. Listen to this. This is complicated, but it's interesting. So yes, Detroit, awesome for slot receivers, bad for outside receivers. So I get that. You're like, Josh, Pittman plays on the outside. Hold your breath. Pittman primarily lines up on the outside, but he does run a little bit in the slot. Last week, he ran 6 routes out of the slot. Whoa. I know people out there, they're like, okay, what the hell is he doing? He's trying to convince us that the guy who plays on the outside and has a bad matchup ran 6 slot routes. He ran 6 slot routes. He received 5 targets on those 6 routes. I'm not kidding you. They basically force-fed him targets. Anytime Pittman was on the slot, you could expect a target. 5 of his 6 slot routes were targets against the Jets last week. I think they're going to scheme up some slot targets for Pittman this week. Wait for it. Watch for it. If you're a film grinder bro out there, watch for it. Pittman's going to get schemed slot targets in a perfect slot matchup. And if you need a desperation flex or wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3 play this week, I legally give you permission for Michael Pittman. Tight end. Start TJ Hockenson, consensus tight end 8 at the Bears. I'm just mentioning his name here because Fantasy Pros consensus rankings currently have Will the Thrill Dissly ahead of him at tight end 7. And personally, me, Josh Larky, putting the chips on the table. I don't know if you can hear that. I'm tapping my table. I don't know how sensitive this mic is. But me personally, I put the chips on the table. I would start TJ Hockenson over Will Dissly. I might sound brave, but that is going against consensus. It is brave. It is brave. Hockenson actually has a slightly better matchup when you adjust for opponents faced than Will Dissly as well. And then at tight end, I would start Sam LaPorta, tight end 15 at the Colts. And I know it's like, oh, it's Sam LaPorta. He's been bad this year, but it's tight end 15. People have already decided they can't start him this week. Tight end 15. That's outside the top 12. Assuming he suits up after injury, he's a good start based on the matchup. The Colts allow 4 fantasy points per game above expectation to tight ends. That's second best in the NFL this year. Now, before we get to the sits this week, before we get to those 4 Underdog Fantasy picks, let me check the comments section. Looking good, Josh. Glad to see the back is healing. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I do look good. The back is healing. Thank you. Thank you. I needed that. Needed that on a Thursday morning. Sit 1, McBride or Dissly. We're gonna sit Dissly. Start 2, Pacheco, Hunt, Tracy, Pollard, Brooks, Bucky. I would start Hunt and Tyrone Tracy, assuming we don't hear more weird stuff with Pacheco. All right. Start 2, Jennings, Debo, or Xavier Worthy. I think I would just tag team the 49ers receivers here, get some ceiling, get some floor. So I like that. Is fast draft like Underdog? Sort of. It's best ball. And there's weekly DFS snake draft type stuff. So I'd say yes to both those fronts. The draft rooms are softer than Underdog. That's often what happens with new platforms. Half PPR. Trade Pacheco and Hockenson for McBride. No. You do not trade Pacheco right before he returns from injury. We don't do that. He was like a top 5 running back in fantasy usage early in the season before his injuries. All right. Start 2 of these guys. Calvin Ridley, Jaden Reed, CeeDee Lamb, DeAndre Hopkins. Oh my God. I don't really have a preference. I know that's a cop-out answer. These dudes are all like wide receiver 2 fringe types. I think I'd go Lamb Ridley, but I don't feel good about that. Michael Wilson or Jalen McMillan? Disgusting. I think we'd lean Wilson just because Evans is coming back. Is Ertz a starter this week? Yes, Ertz is the starting tight end for the Commanders. On a serious note, yeah, I think I'd probably start him. It's Cowboys. It's a good matchup. And before you can argue with me, ad read.
Hey, I know it's a popular statistic to cite, oh, these Underdog Pick Ems, the vast majority of people go more than on any given player. Yeah, close to 80% of people, but that's because it's easier to find the shootouts than it is to find the dud games every Sunday afternoon. Like we knew week 5, Ravens-Bengals was going to be a shootout. And there goes Lamar Jackson for 4 touchdowns. There goes Joe Burrow for 5 touchdowns. Derrick Henry gets there. Zay Flowers is over 100 yards. Jamar Chase and T. Higgins both got there, as well as Chase Brown. Both Chases got there. You go more than, you 100x your payout on Underdog with their Pick 6 contest. But then you look at Dolphins Patriots, that's going down the toilet, right? Too bad Ramondre Stevenson at 18 fantasy points. But you improve your chances at positive returns when you correlate with these Underdog Pick Ems. Use promo code Underworld. This is the biggest bonus Underdog has ever given out, up to $125. Promo code is Underworld. Put in $250, you get $125. Now go start picking.
Oh my God. Oh God. I chugged coffee too quickly. I realized the ad read. Oof. I was up against the clock with the ad read. I needed that extra sip of coffee on a Thursday morning. Folks, that was on me. Quarterback, I don't have any true sits at the position this week. I'm never going to lie to you. It's thin. We've got 6 teams on bye. 2 guys that I want to point out that I think people are considering where you might have better options, but I don't think I would say like sit in terms of like, oh, I think they're going to get you 10 fantasy points. But Drake Maye has a really tough matchup against the Dolphins. Dolphins are holding quarterbacks to 4 points below their season average. So if a quarterback averages 18 fantasy points, they're likely scoring 14 versus the Dolphins. That said, Maye is just playing really well. He's very mobile. One more would be Stafford. The worst matchup for quarterbacks has been the Eagles. They're just playing so well right now. Quarterbacks average they're averaging 5 fantasy points below their season average against the Eagles. So if you thought that Dolphins -4 was bad, the Eagles are -5. So if a fantasy quarterback's averaging 20 fantasy points a game, we should expect 15 fantasy points against the Eagles. So Drake Maye, Stafford, tough matchups this week. Running back, sit Chuba Hubbard. He's the consensus running back 18 versus the Chiefs. He's played so well this year. But the Chiefs are the worst matchup for fantasy running backs. Running backs average 8.5 fantasy points below expectation against the Chiefs. The running back room's 8.5 fantasy points below expected against the Chiefs. I'm still unsure how much Jonathan Brooks plays, but I know he's going to play this week. I think Jonathan Brooks is more of a threat to Chuba's touches than Miles Sanders, who won't play this week. The Panthers have the lowest implied team total of week 12 in the betting markets, 16 points. That's terrible. So you might have 2 better options than Chuba, considering you drafted him late in fantasy football. Another guy that you drafted probably 6th, 7th round would be DeAndre Swift. You might want to sit him this week, or at least consider that the floor and ceiling are reduced. So he's the consensus running back 19 versus the Vikings. The Vikings are the second worst matchup for opposing running backs. Running back rooms average 5 fantasy points below expectation. It's not quite the Chiefs, but it's bad. And last week, with no more Shane Waldron, who's been fired, so you're switching out the offensive coordinator, Swift only outtouched Roschon Johnson 16-11 versus the Packers last week. That's close. In their first game with a new coaching staff. First game, close. Roschon even had 2 of the 3 goal line carries last week. Swift, we should just temper expectations. And if you can, you got 2 better options. Sit him. And then another guy that you could consider sitting who you drafted late in fantasy football. You might have 2 better options. J.K. Dobbins. Consensus running back 20 versus the Ravens. Najee Harris's 63 rushing yards last week against the Ravens were the most any running back has had versus the Ravens this year. Dobbins scored twice in primetime versus the Bengals last week. That's what you remember. What you probably don't remember is he outcarried Gus Edwards 11-6. That's close. And Hassan Haskins had 2 of the team's 3 goal-to-go carries. 2 of the 3 goal area carries went to Hassan Haskins, not J.K. Dobbins, in that Sunday night game. Dobbins is facing a tough run defense, potentially a bad game script, and you're going to remember those 2 touchdowns, but I'm warning you. Another sit this week. We've been going back and forth with Sutton. We've mostly got him right this year. We're going to try to get him right again. He's trending towards a sit this week. Wide receiver 15 by consensus is very high. He's at the Raiders. Only the Eagles have been a worse matchup than the Raiders for outside receivers. The Raiders are a -6 in my matchups charts, meaning whatever outside receivers have been averaging per game, it's 6 below that is what they've actually been scoring. 6 fantasy points below that versus the Raiders. It's the 3rd lowest game total of week 12, Broncos Raiders. Broncos are nearly touchdown favorites. It could be an ugly game. And I just don't think the Broncos will have to do much this week. They might not have to pass very much to just absolutely trounce the Raiders. And then another sit. I hate doing this, but Christian Watson, wide receiver 35 versus the Niners. I understand the interest. He caught all 4 targets for 150 yards versus the Bears last week. But the 49ers who he faces have been a bottom 5 matchup for outside receivers this year. And Christian Watson's averaging just 2 receptions per game. He hasn't had more than 4 in any game this year. Some people out there, they're pointing to his target shares, all like, oh, he's had some good target shares recently. I'll believe it when I see it. He's had some decent target shares, sure, but the team just they haven't been passing as much. Maybe they pass more against the Niners. They probably pass more, but still, we just haven't seen Watson and Love actually connecting on passes this year. We're going on week 12 at this point. He still hasn't topped 4 catches in any game. And like you can start him as an upside desperation flex, but I think some people out there are like, oh, Christian Watson locked and loaded starter right now. And I'd caution you there. Before we get to those underdog fantasy picks, tight end. sit Cade Otton. Consensus tight end 6 at the Giants this week. So here's a few things. So Cade Otton had heavy volume before the Buccaneers week 11 bye. But now Mike Evans is back. Cade Otton is no longer the one in this passing attack. I think it's going to be a run-heavy approach for the most part against the Giants. Remember, Tommy DeVito is starting for the Giants this week. It could get ugly. The Giants haven't faced many strong tight ends this year, but still, they're the worst matchup for tight ends overall in fantasy football. Tight end rooms have averaged 4 fantasy points below expectation against the Giants. That's the worst. I think TJ Hockenson, Jonnu Smith, these are both better options despite being lower ranked by consensus. So I'm not saying like you have to sit Otton, but I think a lot of people with Otton have like David Njoku, who plays tonight, Thursday night. They've got a TJ Hockenson. They've got a Jonnu Smith. There's a lot of guys out there that are better options. I'd even think about someone like Luke Schoonmaker, Cowboys tight end, against the Commanders, since it looks like Jake Ferguson probably won't play with the concussion. Just a lot of options out there that I'd start considering over Cade Otton. We got a question in the chat. Stafford, Geno, or Russ? Russ plays tonight against the Browns. Huh. All right, Geno. Oh God, who do the Seahawks play again? Why am I blanking on this? Wow, let me look that up. Wow. Great radio, Josh. You forgot the Cardinals. Okay. Stafford. I think I'd lean Geno. Or, I don't know. It's all similar. I think they're all in the same tier. So, oh boy. I'd go. We'll go Geno. Final answer for now. All right. Someone says Kyler or Jaden Daniels this week. Jaden Daniels gets the Cowboys. Kyler gets the Seahawks. I think I'd lean Jaden Daniels just because I think they can absolutely spank the Commanders. Someone says Cedric Tillman or Jacoby Myers. I would, I think I'd go Jacoby Myers. Cedric Tillman's got the tough matchup tonight versus the Steelers. I think that's tonight, right? Brown Steelers. My brain operates so strangely. Yeah, that's tonight. Brown Steelers. God. Yeah, I think I'd go Jacoby Myers. I'd hold out. And then someone says Scott Fishbowl, Cade Otton, Dallas Goedert. That I'd go Cade Otton. It rewards receptions heavily there. I think he can get you a few receptions. Folks, we did it. Let's talk underdog fantasy picks. First one, Justin Herbert, higher, 249.5 passing yards. He has at least 279 passing yards, 4 of his past 5 games. Great matchup against the Ravens. Correlate, Lad McConkey, higher, 62.5 receiving yards. Great matchup again. He's averaging 88 yards per game over his past 4 games. Rookies usually continue to improve as the season moves along at the receiver position. And then we'll keep correlating. Oh, Josh, stop correlating. Never. We're going to go J.K. Dobbins lower than 52.5 rushing yards. Only one running back, Najee Harris, has gone over this number versus the Ravens this year. J.K. Dobbins was only out-carried by Gus Edwards 11-6 this past Sunday versus the Bengals. So it's like a 2-to-1 timeshare with the carries. We don't like that. There's the game script concerns. So J.K. Dobbins lower, 52.5 rushing yards. And then we'll hit you because we can't stick with 4 Chargers picks. You need to choose another team. Josh Downs, higher, 4.5 receptions. The number 1 slot matchup of the week is the Colts against the Lions. Downs himself is 6-3 to the over this year. So 2/3 of the time he's hitting the over. He had 5 catches in a much tougher matchup versus the Jets with Richardson at quarterback last week. Folks, week 12, Bimageddon. Good luck out there. That's 19 starts and sits. 4 underdog fantasy picks in 25 minutes. I'm Josh Larky. This is the Dominator for Player Profiler. Check out Fast Draft. Check out Underdog Fantasy. I will see you all next week.
Hey, I want to thank you for being part of this broadcast. If you have any thoughts on it, leave a comment. If you enjoyed it, make sure you leave a like. And if you want to see more shows on the Player Profiler channel, subscribe to it. That's how we know you want more.